Welcome to episode 3 of Listen in Michigan. I'm Deborah Holtschiff, the editor of Michigan Today. In this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Stephanie Steinberg. She's an editor at U.S. News and World Report in Washington, D.C. In 2011, she was the editor-in-chief at the Michigan Daily. Stephanie was just back in town recently for a reunion of Michigan Daily alumni who came back to Ann Arbor to celebrate the paper's 125th anniversary. In anticipation of that anniversary, about 2 years ago, Stephanie began compiling a number of essays from Michigan Daily alumni recounting their experiences at the student newspaper. She's put those essays together into a book titled In the Name of Editorial Freedom, 125 Years at the Michigan Daily. It's a great overview of contemporary American culture and history through the wide eyes of a college journalist. It's really just a great read, covers everything from the civil rights era through 9/11 and beyond. I highly recommend it. The Michigan Daily plays into my next story as well. I have a conversation with Al Guskin, Ph.D., 1968. He's the president emeritus of Antioch University, and he was just 23 years old in October 1960 when then-Senator John F. Kennedy visited the university and encouraged students from the steps of the Michigan Union to dedicate their lives to service and travel the world as part of what would then become the Peace Corps. Al took up the charge, and the rest is history. I also have a quick chat with my colleague Mike Wood, videographer here at Michigan News. Mike was on the scene several weeks ago when a local farmer close to the university discovered a major find under the ground on his farm. So let's go to Stephanie. We're going to start with a conversation about Jay Cassidy. He was a photographer at the Michigan Daily in the late 60s and took a ton of really significant photos, student unrest, images from the Democratic National Convention, some really amazing historical pictures. And Jay has since gone on to become an award-winning film editor. He's worked on movies like American Hustle, Silver Linings Playbook, and he's done a lot of work with Sean Penn as well. So let's hear from Stephanie about how she discovered the significance of Jay Cassidy in the course of making her book.
I met Jay actually through Dan O'Krent, who was another contributor to the book. He was the first public editor of the New York Times, and Dan covered the 1968 Democratic Convention, and he traveled with a bunch of daily photographers and reporters to Chicago to cover it. And so he had a photo of covering the convention that I wanted to use in his story, and that photo was taken by Jay. Well, at the time, I didn't know who Jay was, so I just sent a random email along and asked, I'm working on this book. Would you mind if I use your photo? And Jay responded, of course. And for whatever reason, I decided to just Google Jay's name to see, what else perhaps he's contributed to over the years. And his IMDb page pops up. And lo and behold, Jay is this Oscar-nominated film editor. So I thought, gosh, it would be great to have a story from Jay in the book. And I just asked, would you be willing to share something from your time working at the Daily? And Jay was really gracious and said, absolutely, I'll send you something. A few weeks went by and an email from him landed in my inbox. And I opened it up. He dropped a story in there and a few photos. So I opened up these photos. They are black and white images of Robert F. Kennedy campaigning in Detroit about 3 weeks before he was assassinated. And these photos had never been printed in the Daily before, or anywhere else for that matter. So Jay, wrote about his experience covering RFK and sort of just the entire era and what it was like to be a photographer during that time. And he has a collection of about 4,000 photos that he took while at the Daily. So he donated all those photos to the Bentley.
One of the other great stories, another photographer's story, Andy Sachs, his assignment was to go cover a sit-in, which sounded like a boring thing. What are you going to take pictures of, people sitting? And talk a little bit about what happened with Andy.
Yeah, so this is October 1965, and it's during the Vietnam War, and that night that Andy was sent on this assignment, it was actually during homecoming. So all of the senior photographers were sent to go cover that, and he sort of got this lowly assignment, so he thought. Well, he ended up getting there, and there were dozens of students and other people from the Ann Arbor community who were sitting in the Selective Service office protesting the draft. This was on a Friday, so the office wanted to close up over the weekend, but they didn't want to keep all those people in there. So they ended up calling in the authorities, and they ended up carrying the protesters out down the stairs one by one. And here Andy is with his camera, and he's capturing all of this. At one point, he goes across the street and climbs up a pole and gets like an aerial shot of what's happening below. I think 39 of the protesters were arrested that night.
Sarah Krulwick changed history when she became the first female photographer, quote unquote, allowed on the field at Michigan Stadium. So talk a little bit about Sarah's story. She went on to be a really accomplished photojournalist at the New York Times for many years.
She did, and she still works there today and photographs Broadway plays and a lot of arts events. But Sarah got her start actually at Michigan. This was 1969. And at that time, the year before actually, all the press passes said no women, children, or dogs allowed on the big house field. The following year, in 1969, they changed the press passes to say no women or children allowed. Dogs were now okay because there was an act where a dog would try and kick a football through the goalposts. Or not kick, but, hit it through it. So Sarah, she was a pioneer, and she was with actually Andy Sachs, who we were just talking about. At the time, he was working for UPI and shooting the game. And Andy saw her and said, you know what, Sarah, come with me. Let's go try and get you to cover this game on the field. And I should tell you also, this is Bo Schembechler's first game in the big house.
Wow.
So this is September 1969. And they go down to the field level and encounter a few security guards. And as Sarah tells the story, they approached her and said, you can't be on the field. Can't you read? Your press pass says no women. She said, well, of course I can read, but I got permission from the sports information director that it was okay. That was nothing that he gave her permission to do. But at that point, the guards couldn't really do anything because everyone above them could see them. There's 70,000 people in the stands, and if they started to cause a ruckus, everyone would have seen below what was going on. Mm-hmm. So she and Andy kneeled down and just started shooting, and she became the first female photographer on the big house field.
And what was the deal? Wasn't it her birthday, too?
It was her birthday, and she decided, you know what, I'm going to risk being arrested on my 19th birthday in front of 100,000 people. She ended up changing history, so.
Well, as for teenagers running a newspaper, there are plenty of hijinks that take place as well. So one of my other favorite stories, and I guess it's not one to be super proud of, but in pop culture history, we can be proud of it. The editor, Leslie Wayne, was doing the entertainment section. She left town for a couple days and gave an assignment to her people, and her writers didn't necessarily follow her directions. And talk a little bit about how they changed a little bit of history as well.
So, as you said, Leslie took the night off. She was arts editor, and she gave a bunch of copy to Fred Labor and his buddy, John Gray. They did not take the copy and edit it and put it in the paper as they were supposed to. Instead, Fred had listened to a radio newscast, I guess, the night before that was sort of talking about some conspiracy theories regarding Paul McCartney and whether or not Paul was actually dead. And I guess Fred just found that so amusing and took those conspiracies and embellished them in a very made-up story that he decided to instead print on page 2 of the Michigan Daily. And that story basically said, Paul McCartney is dead, new evidence brought to light, so said the headline. He included all these references to the fact that Paul had actually died 3 years earlier in a car crash. And there's all these clues sprinkled throughout the Beatles' music and their photos and album covers that point to the fact that Paul really is not with us anymore. And for whatever reason, the story just took off. I mean, it was 1969. Yeah, there was no internet, so it's really remarkable that other papers picked it up. It spread across the country. This lasted for weeks. And it wasn't until a Life magazine photojournalist went and tracked down Paul McCartney. He was on vacation somewhere in Europe and took a photo of him and said, you know what, no, Paul is still with us. I think that was exactly what it said on the cover. That, the rumors were sort of debunked, but Fred became pretty famous. He was flown to Hollywood to do interviews and appeared on all these radio broadcasts, and Fred is actually still around today. He's now a part of a country country music group called Riders in the Sky, and he goes by the name of Too Slim.
So funny. Now, of course, there are a number of incredibly serious anecdotes as well. We've kind of focused on some of the more fun ones. There's that piece from Roger Rappaport about going down south during the civil rights movement, and one of the pieces is about covering the affirmative action trial. There are some really interesting things that happen at the university. One of the first cases of internet crime. Somebody writes about their experience covering 9/11. Do you have one that kind of stands out for you?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you mentioned 9/11, and that one was kind of heartbreaking to read at certain points and hard to stomach. That was by Jeff Gagnon, and he is now an editor at GQ. He was the editor-in-chief on that day, and he describes what was happening in the newsroom and the fact that, no one obviously knew what was going on when they were watching the planes hit the towers in the morning of 9/11. And the Daily, like everyone else, had to sort of figure it out and figure out what to put on the front page the next day. And he sort of describes, that process. But what's really impressive is that the Daily didn't just get campus reaction from Ann Arbor, getting the thoughts of students and the professors and the greater community. The Daily sent reporters to Washington, D.C., to New York City, to Pennsylvania, and not only that, they sent a reporter to Afghanistan and Pakistan to actually cover the military response there. And, this is a college paper we're talking about. This is not the New York Times. So it was truly remarkable to hear sort of the behind the scenes and the decision making that went on to cover 9/11 in the weeks afterward.
So talk a little bit about the uniqueness of the Michigan Daily. I'm not sure if people realize who didn't go to school here or who haven't been here for a long time that there is no journalism program here. And much of what goes on at the Michigan Daily is done without any quote-unquote adult supervision. It's really student reporters and editors teaching one another. What kind of influence does that have on the product and the atmosphere there?
Basically, everyone who walks through the Daily doors, they learn from each other. So you're really learning from an editor who's a year or two older than you, had to write a lead or structure a story or the best way to ask interview questions or get a photo. So it's all self-taught, which is it's truly remarkable when you think about it, because we're one of the premier college newspapers in the country and we're just teaching each other. The Daily has this ability to just kick out top-notch journalists. There's no adult in the newsroom at midnight or 2 a.m. when the pages need to get sent to the printer and everyone's cramming on deadline, and it's all you learn on the go. There's no better way to actually learn how to do journalism than sort of being thrown into the deep end of the pool, as Shannon Petty-Peace from Bloomberg sort of wrote about in her story, and she covered the affirmative action case at the university, so that was really being thrown into the deep end of a pool, and somehow it works.
Okay, so let's go to Al. He's going to flash us back to 1960 and that fateful night when Senator Kennedy spoke at the Michigan Union. And looking back on that night and the weeks that followed, Al makes it very clear that something larger was at work, and it took a whole confluence of events to come together in order for the Peace Corps to actually come to fruition.
The probabilities are very low that this should have happened. Even today, 55 years later, it gives me goosebumps. I mean, I've been a president of 2 universities. I've done all these things, and I'm, it's been a long time since this happened, but there's nothing like that. You have to have Sharon Jeffrey, who's a student on the University of Michigan campus, whose mother is Millie Jeffrey, who's the director of the UAW Community Relations and campaign manager for Kennedy. Kennedy comes, talks for 3 minutes. Chester Bowles follows him on the 18th, and then we get the idea. We put it in the Michigan Daily. Michigan Daily is edited by Tom Hayden, who's interested in student activism and loves this. And there's Sharon Jeffrey, who's a student activist on the campus. She tells her mother about what's going on in the University of Michigan campus. She then sends the material to one of the speechwriters, Maya Feldman, who rejects it. And Millie Jeffrey, who is about 5'2" and the most powerful woman I think I ever met, and she wasn't going to take no for an answer. She goes to Sorensen, she goes to Warford. They go to Kennedy, and they write the speech, and everything comes together. The probabilities of this happening. Amazing story. It's very humbling. It's very humbling because it wasn't as if I was a politician who planned this. Like I was a big policy person and figuring out how to create a Peace Corps. It happened, and I was there. I was not involved in international work before. I was not really active in student politics on the campus. I was a graduate student. And why did I decide to make the choice that I did? I can't explain it. This International Center at the University of Michigan was critical in all this. They provided facilities and support and so on. So we were, had mimeograph in those days. You didn't have Xerox machines. And so we decided and it was a leadership group of about 8 people, including the person who was director of the International Center was part of our group. And we decided we're going to have petitions. So we have these events all over campus, and we had petitions being sent out. One of the most interesting things, people who we did not know made copies of the petitions and were submitting it themselves. And then they sent us the list. So it was that thick, had 1,000 names on it. And that impressed Millie Jeffrey a lot, that people were really committed to going.
This is where the story picks up some serious momentum. Senator Kennedy had heard about all this activity on the campus, and while he was making a tour stop in Toledo, invited the students to meet him at the airport. Shortly thereafter, he would give a very significant foreign policy speech at the Cow Palace, and in just a few days, he would be elected President of the United States. Here's Al.
Why did he want to see us 5 days before the election and not have any press there? Fascinating. It was another overwhelming moment in all of this. And he came down from the plane. We were on the tarmac, and we talked with him. And I asked him a question. I said, how serious are you really? And I'm 23 years old. And so he looks at me and he says, until Tuesday, we'll worry about this nation. After Tuesday, the world. And it's a wonderful thing. He just was so on that he could literally, rather than laugh at me, which would have been appropriate actually, given who he is and who I was, he really made a little bit of a joke of it, but a serious joke, and saying it was commitment. The truth was, he wasn't particularly committed to the Peace Corps. I mean, he had a lot of things that he had to do. This Harris Swafford, who was his assistant, told me this personally. He said, all the other letters received by the transition team, asking for places to work, asking what they can do, the Peace Corps had more than all the others combined. And I know that Walter Reuther, who was the head of the UAW, his brother, Victor Reuther, who was in Washington, D.C. as their lobbyist for the UAW, he was deeply committed to it. And he lobbied hard, as did a lot of other people, for Kennedy to really create the Peace Corps. So the most important part of this whole story for me is that the Peace Corps was not created by politicians, not created by big policy people. It was created by young people who wanted to do something. And that continued right up to the time that the Peace Corps was created on March 1st. There were obviously big-time policy people. Sergeant Shriver was masterful in creating it, but it was because of the young people, the students, that exist. That's a wonderful story.
This year, the Peace Corps received its highest number of applications in 40 years. So, suffice to say, Al's efforts are still bearing fruit. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to hear from Mike Wood, my colleague. He was on the scene for a very unexpectedly, unbelievably huge story. The video he produced has been seen by over 650,000 people. So here's Mike.
I was doing a video story with Dan Fisher over in the Museum of Natural History, and it was 10 o'clock on Wednesday of that week. And he just mentioned before we got started, he said, yeah, I got an email from this farmer nearby. He found some bones. And I was like, oh, bones? I said, are you going to go out there? And he said, well, probably. And so I asked if I could go along to shoot video. And I was thinking really just to get a little extra video for the story I was doing, kind of see what they do. And he was saying, we get these all the time. It may not be anything. And by 10 o'clock that night, I got an email. He said, look, my team's going to be there at 9 in the morning. If you want to come along, come along. So I went out to the farm. I got there. It was the middle of a field. There's an excavator, backhoe digging away. Dr. Fisher and several of his students and PhD candidates and stuff were down in this hole, 8 feet down, all muddy. And I looked in there, and there was nothing that I could see other than mud and digging and slopping around. And I kept shooting, and they were like, oh, we found something. And the more I'd zoom in, and I still really didn't see anything. And then they said, we found a tusk. We have a tusk. And they all got excited. I still really didn't see it, even in my camera. And then they started outlining, scooping away more and more mud and dirt, and you could see a tusk. That's when I realized, wow, that's pretty cool. They found a tusk. Shortly after, they found another tusk, and then he said, they're still connected to the skull. And the more excited those guys got, the more excited I got, and was like, wow, this is pretty significant. I looked up from my camera, and all of a sudden there's townspeople kind of meandering out to the site and neighboring farmers, and it kind of got more and more exciting. And then you start thinking about 10,000-year-old animal roaming around this land. Coincidentally, I grew up in that area too, and so it was like, wow, who knew? My colleague Jim Erickson, who's our science writer, he was getting quotes from the researchers and everything, and it turned out to be just this really neat part of history that we were able to be a witness to. And the thing that made it really interesting was the farmer was reluctant kind of at first. I mean, he had a drain to put in, and he has soybeans that he needed to harvest in the coming weeks or, days. And he told Professor Fisher, he said, you have 1 day. Usually these things take a month, maybe 2 months. And he knew he had 1 day. And so it's so bizarre that from the beginning of the day, when I'm looking into this muddy pit of nothing, by the end of the day, it was like probably 5 o'clock when they finally raised up that skull and the tusks. I think part of it was that fast. They just worked like crazy. Professor Fisher never left the hole hardly. He was just in there, and these young students trying to keep up with him. And his wife was there literally sticking sandwiches in his mouth any chance he could, and he wouldn't stop. He just kept digging and digging because he knew he had 1 day, and he wanted to get as much of this find as he could. And, of course, the more they found, the more they realized how significant it was, and they had to get everything. And it was just amazing, all in 1 day, from thinking there might be something to pulling out this amazing find that was like, 14,000 years old. It was just crazy. There was a lot of things that kind of came together that day, I think, to make it, an interesting story and kind of a classic story. Any story needs characters, and especially with video. And, you had Professor Dan Fisher, who's, lifelong paleontologist, and he's just got that classic look in the video where he's got mud all over his face. He's been working all day in the excavating these bones. And the landowner, Jim Brisley, who is just a hardworking farmer who was just trying to drain some water off his soybean field. And he was a great character. And then all the people that came and were shooting video with their iPads and iPhones and whatever else. And it was just kind of a neat thing full of just the perfect story, I guess, full of characters.
All right, well, that's it for episode 3. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't heard episode 1 or 2, there's a lot of good stories on there, so I hope you can listen. Thanks again. We'll see you next time. And of course, as always, go blue.